There is a war going on, a war that's been going on for many, many years within the understanding of Overwatch 2 and really going all the way back to Overwatch 1. I like to call it East versus West, but honestly, it goes a lot deeper than that. You see, one of the big fundamentals of Overwatch is timing, and another one of the big fundamentals of Overwatch is positioning. If you've seen any of my videos over really the last 3, 4, even 5 years, we talk a lot about those two things, but what do those two things really mean, and why are they in so many ways clashing? How does it affect professional Overwatch, going from the Contenders Overwatch League and even the recent Flash Ops tourney? And how does it affect ranked play? Well, I want to talk about a little bit of all of these things in today's video, and hopefully you come away with a better understanding, not just of the history of professional Overwatch macro, but what you could be doing in your games to actually improve your level of play. So let's actually talk about positioning and timing. And I'm going to use a crappy paint overlay. You guys are going to have to bear with me. And we're going to talk about positioning versus timing. So basically, positioning we'll define as off angles. So there, prioritizing the best positions that your characters can take while controlling the most map. And angles are great for sightlines. Angles are great for flanking and catching people off guard. Angles are great for splitting attention. If I'm playing Tracer with my team, I'm doing myself a disservice to the characters that are better with grouped up with my team. If I'm playing Bastion, understandable to play with my team, but if I'm playing Tracer Sombra, I should be living on the flank. I'm going to be taking angles, I'll be taking better positions. Same thing goes for Widowmaker. Same thing goes with even characters like Zenyatta, Ana, and Kiriko. And then there's timing, where timing is the aspect of essentially, think of it as team play, right? Timing is essentially what we're going to do is we're going to do it together at the same time, working together. Now, some of you guys who've watched me before, or maybe familiar with Overwatch macro and Overwatch strategy, go like, well, you can have both, right? You could have both good off angles and have good team play. And that's 100% true. But the reality of the situation is that in a lot of ways, those things conflict with each other. For example, if you're on an off-angle Tracer, it is harder to work with your team because it's harder to be aware of when they're actually doing something. How many times have you gone on an off-angle with a character that goes on off-angles and messed up your timing or messed up your team flow? I didn't know we were kiting back, or I didn't know we were fighting there, or my bad, I was late or I was early. That's very easy to mess up when you're not with your team. And how many times have you grouped up with your team but taken a loss or taken an L because you failed to account for an off angle, or everybody grouped up and we all got frozen by the enemy blizzard, or we gave them a 5-man shatter, or we let them control high ground? And so what ends up happening is that you have these compositions, these understandings, macro really even, where they conflict with each other. And finding that balance is not only tricky, but darn near impossible, especially in a fast-paced game like Overwatch. So what I want to talk about is how do you coincide those? Because really both are crucial, but they strain at each other. The more angles that you control with a character like Tracer, the more angles that you're going to be able to deny to the enemy team. But also at the same time, the more angles that you control, you're also going to have a higher chance of messing up your timing. For example, if my team is all the way over there and I'm all the way over here, as I said, it's a lot harder to synchronize and work together with your team. That doesn't mean that you should play with your team. In fact, that's the worst thing that you can do. But you need to understand that, hey, I'm taking an off angle, but it does mean that it's a little bit harder to maintain timing with my team, so I need to give that extra attention. In fact, one of the biggest common errors that I see with flankers, whether it's Tracer, Wrecking Ball, Winston, Diva, Sombra, anything, is that timing. And on the flip side of things, if I'm working with a character like, let's say, a Reaper or a Bastion, let's just go with Reaper right here. A lot of the times with Reaper, it's very easy to just stand in front of the enemy tank and shoot the enemy tank standing with your tank, right? And that's all good and that's fine and all. And it's very easy to work together as a team. However, with a lot of Reapers and a lot of team play characters with a little bit less mobility, I actually have to spend more time talking about angles, talking about positioning, because they have a tendency to overemphasize working with their team at the expense of taking off angles. For example, if I'm grouped up with my tank 24/7 and never ever using my teleporter to get behind, access enemy flankers, and so on, then I'm doing my team a disservice. But it's hard to do that with Reaper because the character feels just, oh, I just stand with my tank and I shoot the enemy tank. And so you leave yourself open to missing off angles. So it's like, what's the cardinal sin of a flanker? It's messing up the timing. What's the cardinal sin of a Brawl character? Well, it's messing up your off angles. And I think it's really easy to look at this as the West versus East, because if you haven't been super familiar with the professional Overwatch macro, at least historically, Korea and Asian general cultures in general have been a lot better at dive compositions. Just the Asian meta is more likely to play Winston and Tracer and Sombra. Now, I don't know why that was the case. I assume it was just because a very famous Korean streamer started playing this character and then other people played it. Little things like that can snowball. I mean, it's been 7-8 years, really, so who can even remember? But long story short is that Asian generally tends to favor dive. So talk about East versus West. That's kind of how it started here. And I think the same thing happens with the West And by the West, I mean generally the EMEA region and NA, so America, Europe, Saudi Arabia, and so on, where the West tends to favor Brawl. And by Brawl, I don't just mean Reinhardt, but just generally more pokey-style characters that don't have quite as much mobility. So that could be Brawl or Poke, we'll just say. But regardless, characters that don't have as many angle-taking opportunities. And in general, one of the jokes, at least within the Tier 2 and the Overwatch League coaching community, is that the NA coaching, North American coaching and Europe coaching is, guys, we just need to group up and go faster. We need to focus, target focus better, or we need to set the tempo. And a complete neglect and really just a lack of understanding of off angles and controlling of space. Whereas it is a very classic Eastern thing, a very classic Asian Korean thing to have lackluster team play and to control a lot of angles, be really good at those characters, but to really not have the hive mind that you need to execute well. And the reality of the situation is that the most successful teams in Overwatch League and professional Overwatch history have had some sort of a balance in between. Not necessarily a cultural balance where they had both Korean and American players, although that has also been the case to an extent. But at the very least, having Western teams that had a good understanding of dive or more good understanding of off angles and taking good positions, or Korean and Chinese teams with a good understanding of team play and timing. There's a lot of examples of these. Actually, let me pull up a few. Going back to just the most recent grand finals, the Florida Mayhem and the Houston Outlaws, two amazing teams, but the Florida Mayhem were infamous for not only being great at understanding Brawl, dive, and spam, but being a team that was remarkable at coming up with off angles, coming up with alternative positions, controlling space, and yet at the same time having some of the best team play and communication in all of the Overwatch League. In fact, some of the best team play that we've seen ever. Just in this example right here, you can see, I mean, this is ridiculous. Checkmate on the flank on May, looking to threaten the backline. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that, this is something that you would almost never ever see from so many other teams at this level, and it's really what gave Florida Mayhem the W, is doing plays like this. Going back even further in the season, Atlanta Reign, a team that was not only super, super good at dive fundamentals in terms of the characters that they were playing and the angles they were taking, but some of the best timing, some of the best team play that you will ever see, whether Brawl or dive. Really to execute a dive, it's not good enough to just take off angles. You also have to synchronize your pressure at the same time and work together as a unit, whether it's push and pull, taking angles, using your ults, chaining ultimates, layers, all of those things. And Atlanta Reign was maybe some of the best team play, mid-season especially, some of the best team play that we've ever seen in the history of the Overwatch League. And again, this is a full dive team executing with quote-unquote Western fundamentals of team play. Going back further to last season, the season before last, the London Spitfire, I worked with this team, and one of the best things that we did was playing Brawl in a lot of ways like dive, controlling space, controlling off angles, a lot of positioning while we still had the hive mind of pushing and pulling. When you're playing in a dive meta as Brawl, really you couldn't group up. We tried that many times. It didn't work out so well. You had to learn to be able to control off angles, and that's something that a lot of teams were not able to match us on. Spark on an off angle with Admiral. A Lucio not even with our Reinhardt. Our Reinhardt doing crazy dive Winston things. And a lot of people have found that that's actually something that's not just for dive characters, it's for ball characters alone, or also, which is what we're talking about. And then going back even further, one of the best teams in Overwatch League history, the 2021 Shanghai Dragons, which played a dive hybrid Briggs in Sombra Tracer Ball Diva to absolute perfection, and through controlling multiple angles with multiple flankers and yet somehow having this perfect cohesion, this perfect coordination all the time. Absolutely dumbstering Brawl teams that were more grouped up and quote-unquote more cohesive. And again, all these things that these guys have in common is that they did both things well. They didn't just control off angles well. They didn't just have this hive mind team play, but they did both. So the question is like, how do you get both? How do you learn to prioritize which? And I think that's where things get a little bit trickier, because when we talk about how do you know what angles are good to take, I think you actually really have to start with a solid understanding of the fundamentals of the characters that you're playing. For example, what's a good angle for Tracer? What's a good angle for Winston? What's a good angle for Widowmaker? You see, one of the teams that I actually brought up in the example were the London Spitfire, a team that did not so well this past season playing dive, even though they had their remarkable success of the season before. And why is that? Well, turns out that if you're not quite as good at the individual characters, you might not know what good angles are. In other words, if I'm focusing really, really hard on playing Sombra, if I don't know what good angles are in Sombra in the new meta, I might spend a lot of time thinking about what good angles are, and I might accidentally screw up my timing. You see, one of the really crucial parts of having a team that's good with timing and good with positioning is that really the positioning almost needs to be automatic. And for the positioning to be automatic, you have to be good at the character. How do you know what angles to take on Widowmaker if you haven't played a ton of hours on Widow? How do you know what angles to take on Tracer if you haven't played a ton of hours on Tracer, and Kiriko and Ana and Zenyatta and D.Va and so on? So one of the problems with London Spitfire this past season is that they didn't have that automatic installation. I know these characters through and through, so I could focus only on my team play, my timing. And so what ended up happening is that they messed up both. And that's the key thing. If you look at a consensus from all the teams that we showcased here, you're going to notice that pretty much without exception, all the people playing those characters were already good at those characters. Hadi on Reinhardt, Lip on Sombra, going even into Donghak on Winston, a character that he struggled with initially. He had to make leaps and bounds in that character to be able to play well, because when you're focusing on team play, you don't have time to think about positioning. That needs to be almost automatic. And I think that's the trickiest part, is you really just have to know the character itself for you to be able to execute at it. So what do we do with this information? How do we actually move into it? Why is dive so positioning based? Well, I think the answer to that question is because you have characters with high mobility, you have a lot more option, many more options, excuse me, to choose how to position yourself. For example, if I'm playing Reaper, just by the nature of Teleporter being one of the worst cooldowns in the game, angles are important, but I don't really have to make that many decisions about which angles to take because there aren't that many angles that I can take. I'm limited with what I can do. But if I go back to spawn and I swap Tracer, the number of positions and the number of angles that I can take at least doubles, if not triples. There are now, instead of I can take that angle or that flank, that's it. Tracer, I can take anything almost I want. And that's what makes those characters so hard to play at the high level. And that's something that the East has been historically really good at, is being able to download and autopilot and understand those characters so well that they can go through all those details and do so really well. And yet at the same time, the East has struggled with some of the more Brawl metas, because one of the key components of a Brawl meta is what I would call the team play timing of push and pull. This is something that we'll have to talk about in a later video. I'm actually going to do a full video on Overwatch 2 macro. But the idea of push and pull is when do I swing as Reinhardt and when do I shield? When do I push and when do I kite? And you're like, oh, well, that's not too hard. Well, what if it's a Rein, Lucio, Mei near? Do you push off of your Mei wall? Do you kite their Mei wall? Do you go in with your Blizzard, or are you scared of their Blizzard? How do you push and pull? How do you trade those ultimates? And that is also very complicated. The trading of ultimates especially becomes a really advanced, complicated concept, especially when you factor in that you should be taking a couple of angles too. And that's something that historically Western teams with great communication, great timing, and a smart IGL generally do very, very well in. And that's something that they have an advantage over some of the Eastern teams with those repetitions. So you have really two things, whether it's the high-level planning, the high-level timing, and the high-level positioning, the high-level off-angling. That means that there's a lot more flexibility for Eastern players to perform well at dive, because those are already better, or they play more of those characters, and Western players play more of the Brawl. And I think regardless of whether it's East versus West, I keep using that because it's easy vernacular, it's easy terminology, but regardless of whether Eastern players are better at these characters or Western players are better at those, it doesn't really matter. The point being is that you need to be asking yourself, if you're competing in a team, or even if you're just a ranked player, if you're just performing on ranked, what do you need to be working on? Where are you lacking? Are you a Reaper player that never considers off angles? Are you a Rein player that doesn't understand the push and pull and how to play around enemy Brawl ultimates? Are you playing scrimmaging with a Masters or a Grandmaster team, and right now your team is lacking in team play and communication? Maybe you guys are grouping up too much and not taking enough off angles. For most of you, it's going to be a little bit of both. So how do you actually improve? How do you actually prioritize those things? And I actually think that the answer is tough. You really actually have to be very self-aware about where your biggest shortcomings are. For example, whenever I'm working with a team, I generally like to prioritize team play first, because I think that having an idea of at least a very basic shot calling fight plan is really, really important. But I also think that if you don't have any understanding of when and where to take off angles, that needs to be priority too. So here's the solution. It's not an easy solution, but it's a simple solution. You need to be self-aware about not only your gameplay, but if you're working with a team, your team's gameplay, and you need to have a sense of hierarchy about what do we need to prioritize first. What is the next hurdle to jump? And if you're not sure what that next hurdle is, find the easiest one. For example, if you guys currently don't have an ult track or fight plan, that's your simplest, fastest way to have a timing fix. If you guys don't even have a 3, 2, 1, we engage on a Brawl, dive, or even just a spam. I'm telling you something, this also applies to spam. If I don't have a communication structure where my Sigma calls when he's shielding so that we can learn to take trades on the enemy Sigma shield, then you're throwing. And that's the low bar. If you guys have a tendency when you're playing Brawl to, like, let's say your Sojourn Hanzo player never ever takes off angles and only groups up with the Rein, Well, guess what? That's a priority too. So you do need a little bit of self-awareness, or you need some outside coaching to tell you what your priorities are. The good news is you don't need to be perfect to improve. You just need to know what the next low-hanging fruit is and address that as quickly as you possibly can until it's autopilot, until you can actually execute those off angles with your DPS, until you can actually execute that timing of engaging and timing of disengaging with your team almost without even thinking. You see, I think learning in Overwatch 2 how to apply these concepts is the key thing to actually improving not only your play, but your team's play as a whole. I don't care if you're a plat on a player. Ask yourself, am I working together with my team well? Am I taking angles well? Could I be taking better angles? Could I be timing better? Am I playing tracer? Should I be checking my backline's positioning more often, or are the angles that I'm taking really, really bad? And that's where it takes a little bit of self-analysis and ultimately just a little bit of study of the game to actually know the answer to that question. So I guess the key thing to wrap this up is ask yourself, what's your next step? What's your low-hanging fruit? Do you need to learn from the dive? Do you need to learn from the brawl? Because as it is, the highest level of Overwatch team play benefits both from timing and positioning, and likely you probably need to improve at a little bit of both. I know it's a little bit more of an advanced concept, so let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.